Marshall, the civil rights crusader, a man who was instrumental in ending legal segregation and later became the first African-American justice of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was born in 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. His mother, an educator, and father, a railroad porter, steered Marshall into a law career. After graduating with honors from Lincoln University, Marshall applied to the University of Maryland Law School, but was denied because he was African American. So he traveled for an hour daily to Howard University Law School under the tutelage of a prominent NAACP attorney, Charles Hamilton Houston.
One of the suggestions made to Thurgood Marshall by Charles Hamilton Houston was to go to the deepest South, into those pockets of the country where resistance against equality and desegregation were the toughest, and pay attention to the people, listen to them, hear their stories, and understand that you are working for a cause that's bigger than being a lawyer, bigger than being a law graduate, bigger than even anything you can imagine in your life. And Thurgood Marshall took on that mantle.
In 1934, Marshall graduated magna cum laude from Howard. The following year, he started a private practice and eventually succeeds his mentor, Charles Houston, to become the NAACP's chief counsel. During this time, Marshall systematically dismantles the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that upheld racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. He argued 32 civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, winning 29.
He wanted to establish the building blocks of earlier cases. He didn't want this issue to come up early in the litigation. And I learned a lot about how a person can try to influence the development of an issue over a long period of time.
In fact, it was 13 years before Marshall had a chance to challenge separate but equal with the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. The ruling ended segregation in the U.S. By now, Thurgood Marshall is a household name, but not everyone is in favor of the landmark decision.
It took an enormous amount of guts. He told us the story about how he'd have to move sometimes 2 or 3 times a night from home to home in order to stay safe. He told us the story about how he was very close to being lynched one time. It wasn't just his client, it was he who was in danger.
Justice Marshall was a great admirer of the man I wound up working for, Judge Harold Tyler. And Tyler had been an assistant attorney general in charge of civil rights. One day in the fall of 1960, Marshall was down in New Orleans and was advised that the Klan was coming to get him that very night. He called Tyler, he had Tyler's home number. Within an hour, the FBI picked up Marshall and put him in a secure location and saw him through that. And Marshall credited Tyler with saving his life.
The death threats didn't stop Marshall. After the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, Thurgood continued to defend civil rights demonstrators until he was appointed in 1961 to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Of all his rulings, none were overturned by the Supreme Court, and by 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice.
It was fascinating to see the multiple aspects of his personality, the personable, sociable storyteller, the precise taskmaster, just an amazing and remarkable, unique human being.
What was most delicious about the clerkship were these stories. And they ranged from hanging out with Langston Hughes and Lena Horne, Joe Louis, meeting with Prince Philip, helping draft the Kenyan Constitution. Every single story was like gold.
One of Marshall's favorite stories, and Marshall told stories all the time. Many of them were about race relations, many of them were serious subjects, but he always would tell a story with his booming laugh, and they always had a funny ending, even when he was making a very serious point. All the new judges were supposed to come up for a photo shoot, and the photographer blew a fuse while setting up his equipment. So they called for an electrician. Who should walk into the room next? Thurgood Marshall. The secretary looked up at him and said, "Oh, you must be the electrician." He laughed about the story, and why did he laugh? Because at the time the trade unions in New York were all segregated, and he said, "That woman must be crazy to think that I could be a member of the electricians union in New York City."
In 1991, Thurgood Marshall announced he was retiring from the bench.
It came as a complete shock to us. The morning he did it, he called us in and he said, "Well, I've decided to give it up." And I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, I've already sent the letter to the president." There was this part of me who, until he said that, I was going to try to talk him out of it. "No, you can't do this, you can't do it." He had already done it. And as far as I could tell, nobody in his chambers knew.
And when reporters asked him why,
"Well, I'm old. I'm getting old and coming apart."
2 years later, Thurgood Marshall passed away at the age of 84.
What made Thurgood Marshall an exemplary leader, in my view, is that he never stopped having utter empathy for common folk, people who were disadvantaged, and he dedicated his life to using the law to help those folk, regardless of color.
It reinforced my interest in public service. When you have a role model like that, when a person like that who's putting his life on the line in the interest of the ideals, it's very hard to want to do anything other than to find a way to give back. There's almost nothing any of us can do in this generation that rivals the level of commitment and risk that he put on the line, for the causes he believed in.
Today, you can find numerous memorials from coast to coast honoring Justice Thurgood Marshall, from courthouses to national airports, even the building I'm standing in now. For the U.S. courts in the Thurgood Marshall Federal Judiciary Building, I'm Bridget Lyles. Thanks for watching.
Stop talking about how far we've come and start talking about how close we are. I repeatedly tell young people, you're better off than before. And be patient and things will get better. And the thing that gets me now is not only telling me that's what you told my father, they say that is what you told my grandfather and things are no better for me. It's admitted in the New York Times reports, or Time magazine, that a recent survey shows that racism is broader and stronger than before. We're not gaining ground, my friends. We might be losing. But one thing I'm sure of, this is no time to stop.
Talking about religion, just momentarily, let's digress. Let's turn to the role of the church just for a minute, the role of the church in race relations. Billy Graham was quoted by Life magazine in October of 1956. Mr. Marshall is saying, "Most ministers agree that race relations are worse now than 2 years ago. With an uneasy conscience, most of them confess that the church is doing far too little about it." Do you agree that this is so?
I agree that the church is doing not enough. And one very good Negro churchman, Dr. Benjamin Mays of Atlanta, Georgia, said at one World Church meeting that the biggest segregation problem in the South occurred on Sunday in the churches.
Was this a white minister?
No, this was a Negro. And that's been repeated.
Which denominations are most lax in this respect, in promoting segregation?
Well, I would say that let's take the other side. The Catholic Church has done a terrific job. Not perfect, but a terrific job in the South in desegregating its parochial schools even before the decisions, and in desegregating its churches. It's not complete, but it's a well-done job. On the other hand, the Baptists, the Southern Baptists, have adopted a resolution supporting the Supreme Court decision. I think the Methodists have, but I see no implementation on the lower level. On the individual pastor's level on the Protestant church, there are several who have spoken out and indeed lost their pulpits. And don't ever forget one of the brightest spots of the Clinton, Tennessee situation, which was a horrible one, was when the Protestant minister, Reverend Taylor, who I believe was a Baptist, took it upon himself to carry those children into the school, and as a result was beaten up.
But you still feel that by and large the church is not doing enough about it?
I don't think they are on the local level, and I believe that if the churches on the local level would take a firm position, that would be a 10 strike on getting this thing through.